If you go back and look at Ralph Breaks the Internet, the scene most people remember is when Vanellope talks to the other Disney princesses, including those who don't count under the brand and are not princesses at all if you know my own opinion. That this film really opened up the floodgates of Disney patting itself on the back with the presence of its own on the internet, which by now is actually very outdated by the looks of some things. But again, the princesses themselves do remain to be timeless and are well remembered even though the nature isn't really right. But the main reason to bring up something like this is how all the Disney princesses up until this point were featured together in one room. It was like the first major crossover event in all of its film history that has never been done before, but actually has in other aspects. Of course, they did it outside their own animation studio sometimes when it came to television or movies, or of course other live-action hybrid movies like Who Framed Roger Rabbit, but this is not what you're kind of realizing when I'm talking about what is going to be discussed here. Which yes, I am talking about the potential of a Disney crossover movie. No, not the kind of crossover having different studios involved at all, cause that will never happen today, as I can guarantee you outside of the live-action hybrid films like Roger Rabbit, but more of the characters from different films joining into one adventure. Walt Disney Animation Studios being together in one film. It's something I thought for many years, considering we just went through the 100th anniversary 2 years ago with Once Upon a Studio, bringing every animated character together and the remaining parts of this vast Disney world, the likes that only again the series could ever produce to even show that. Of course, there's also going to be this major element that makes you understand why this isn't a possibility today, but how it's still an interesting one if you try to connect the dots like so many people did to hold on to the wackiness of things like the Pixar theory. But speaking in terms of this idea I've had and looking back on the crossover paths relates to some weird dreams I've got in the past involving most princesses in some form and their kingdoms under threat. I thought of this idea of the entire Disney universe together unraveling amidst the conflict between two apprentices of the sorcerer Yen Sid from Fantasia. Like, I really thought to combine the elements of that film as the backstory for the existence of the Disney film universe, and it's where I really thought to myself, what if one apprentice went rogue and tried to remake or destroy it for himself into his own image, combining ideas from other video games like Epic Mickey and then extending it to why Walt Disney Animation's films exist in the current state that we know them as, and also the duty of the other half trying to save it with the princesses and heroes involved in those such realms, connecting to a bigger picture that exists across time and space. It's really weird concept to bring up since it was just a dream of mine, but it did bring up a very interesting question that even others have asked before that would be very interesting for audiences to see potentially, and why it probably would have been better than Wish Again as an anniversary film. Again, speaking of anniversaries or milestones, you have to consider how Tango was celebrated as the 50th animated film they released up to that point, with the opening logos and intros that celebrated them as Disney moved forward in time. Which we should also bring up one of the original ideas for their 50th film was also the first Mickey Mouse film that potentially had other characters join him on this adventure for the search for Mickey Mouse, involving Basil Baker Street from his film The Great Mouse Detective to find him alongside other numerous Disney cameos. But they just never went through that script because they found those Disney cameos to be too gimmicky to release to a general audience, where clearly, as you can see by those ideas here, the idea of a crossover film in the general eye just doesn't seem like the appropriate thing to do for a movie if they couldn't figure it out. But nevertheless, important to see how it was actually thought of. Like, even if you thought it wouldn't work, doesn't mean the idea wasn't intriguing enough to have, and technically with Ralph, it became the culmination of having such an idea. But before we get into more of what Ralph did that actually made this a possibility, we should discuss the television series on their own that had crossover events. And of course, because this video is just about Disney crossovers in general, this actually begins with the Hercules itself, with having its own TV series coming out a year after the movie, where if you remember what happens in the movie, there is a small cameo in reference to another Disney film in The Lion King, with Scar's body used as a pelt or rug, which was also referenced by Zazu, who would think he would look better as that, where you could assume the film's events both take place not far from each other in the same time frame after Scar was killed, with Phil getting him picked up at that very moment. But before the majority of events of the Hercules movie is that TV show where you had this episode called Hercules and the Arabian Nights, an episode that involved Aladdin helping him out and trying to stop Jafar from returning from the underworld with Hades' help. The show is where we see Herc is still in training, where the episode takes place after the film King of Thieves, judging by dialogue and the clothes that are involved, and of course the dead Jafar trying to help, where you can see these two Disney Renaissance characters interact in a way that actually works. Like, that we know in this universe, their stories actually don't take place long after each other, and it's something that makes sense, even though other continuity rules through others like Genie or time periods might specifically say it wouldn't make sense on the other hand. But on the other side of things, it showed us how Aladdin, Lion King, and Hercules could exactly take place in the same world that we always thought of, and left a good door open to probably more of it. Because who wouldn't salivate at the idea of having more than one Disney villain interact with another, or their heroes too, to have them combat each other or actually work with each other. It seems like a home run of an idea, just like it was when The House of Mouse came out and had all these scenarios that you could think of where the Disney characters hung out after their off time. Which, to that reasoning, you could probably see that this part of the video is just an excuse to talk about this show, because it was my childhood favorite and actually did take that crossover concept to the extreme, even if it was for just simple regular cartoons of Mickey Mouse and friends being shown. But this is the one that counts the most, because outside of the Mickey in the game that we all know interact with each other in their own movies and shows, it really was featuring Walt Disney animation characters up until Atlantis interacting with each other when the movie came out. Like, it was this sort of celebration of their own achievements and what they could do with them. The same thing of what you could think of when the movie came out alongside the series called Mickey's House of Villains, with Jafar taking a group of villains against Mickey to control that very house. A fun series and interesting concept where you could see various moments of them working to a degree, even if it was for small television, since the actors were still voicing them, and it's under the Disney brand, so it made sense. Made sense to the point where they can all interact with each other no matter who they are, or fight each other if that's the scenario that they were working with. And since I said they stopped at Atlantis as far as Disney films go, the very next film released in Lilo & Stitch also did something different for what the Disney universe could entail in terms of its very own series, and the animated series it produced, and specifically of the Disney Channel. Like Kim Possible episodes amongst many others released at the time interacting with Lilo & Stitch that starred in its own movie earlier that year, matching its early 2000 settings with what could happen in that world. I mean, it's not something to really focus on that much since we were dealing mostly with animated films canon, but it also proved how far it could go depending on what they could do, which technically, if you want to mention that, is where Disney Channel itself, with the shows they created outside of it, mostly live action, would also showcase that their shows took place in the same universe as each other, with each episode getting a crossover the other week. But again, going back to focus on animation alone is just within things that make sense for its time and setting. Like before Ralph, it was just these shows that, like Disney Junior, that would really even put multiple princesses together to interact, but separately, as it hasn't been really done before. In fact, outside of these shows, the princesses haven't really done much other than appear in their own movies. And the last time Disney did a princess movie was for a DVD film that wasn't really liked that much, that starred Aurora and Jasmine, most notably for its bad portrayal of Aurora that even her original actress did not even like in the slightest. Of course, she didn't voice her in that project, but just feeling how it really wouldn't work in regards to how the character was, where the movie was just these short stories centered around their lives after the movie that told a generic message to follow your dreams. That the film was more of an actual Disney product itself rather than something unique to the story of the characters just because you could do something with the princess brand. In fact, it just felt like you bought merchandise of the princesses in an animated format rather than an actual film or series like it actually was intended to be. The original idea of this is how they would have multiple spin-offs of characters in their own settings with the same overlapping idea that would have featured something completely different for Aurora and Belle, but that just never went through like the rest of them because of how poorly it performed and the fact that the company was restructuring its animation departments. That their grand attempt at having their own characters featured in a broader aspect still wasn't a real crossover like their series proved, where they really didn't know what to do beyond that, even for a princess brand where they all could have came together. Until of course the Wreck-It Ralph films came along that proved all along the lines of familiar properties in gaming we know in the real world, until it came time to Disney again patting itself off in the sequel. Like, even though I hate the film for the most part, I have to admit I enjoy all of their interactions with each other as princesses, for the most part of course, in a way that could make sense to the characters, with Vanellope being a princess and how their own messages ironically time into the same theme they all try to play with the failure of that Enchanted Tales film. Like, this actually changed the way you could have thought of having these characters together compared to all the series of the past if they followed something like Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which, technically speaking more about it, helped the Renaissance grow in its own way with the crossover of animated characters of classic both inside and outside Disney in the real world of that very time, where they were just actors from an animated dimension. So why wouldn't such an idea still exist today? Again, other games like Kingdom Hearts have also proved that with putting Sora with Goofy and Donald into, well, most of their well-known properties, even though some of those worlds are just contained events to what still happened in the movie with their own inserts like they were just background characters, but how you can have multiple people in the same room as each other, right? Like, why wouldn't you do more than what you have here with each princess or other hero playing to their own strong suit, whether it be a villain or a psychic different type? Like, what would have happened without them if they didn't all join in together in those moments as a team? What consequence could have arrived if it weren't for them? Maybe a better film in terms of Ralph, but just thinking beyond that, in that same dream that I had that I would like to mention, is something very interesting. Because why wouldn't you tempt fate to suggest the idea of a Disney animated version of the Avengers? Because that would be something cool and also very original than just straight sequels or live action films. But again, these are all just silly ideas we have in our heads rather than actual competent films that make more sense for a broader audience to view. Yet how it's also very tempting to think of such ideas to create something worthwhile of the characters we love of all shapes and sizes. After all, some of these projects have been discussed as ideas in the past and are still pretty viable. Like, they may be different, but they all come under the same branch of the theme that's all connected to the human heart itself. To persevere out of impossible situations to make it possible, and that's where the magic really is. And if we made something that represented all of that together with a conflict of two magicians who thinks what's right or wrong like the actual company does, then maybe we could make something so beautiful it becomes a masterpiece of art that carries throughout the generations. Where this has been a very short thought on the history and potential of the Disney crossover movie and why we all love to see our characters be under the same roof. I'm all done. Goodbye.